It was a regular afternoon in downtown Cincinnati, the kind where the sky threatened rain, but never quite followed through. The air was thick, carrying the scent of damp pavement mixed with grease from nearby fast food joints. The city moved as it always did, a blend of hurried pedestrians, aimless wanderers, and people simply lost in thought. Among them was JD Vance, walking at a steady pace, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. Dressed casually, he didn't stand out much, though some people recognized him. A few stole glances, whispering to one another. Some had seen him on TV, others had read about him in the news. His name carried weight, but at this moment, he was just another guy navigating the busy streets. As walked past a row of aging storefronts, dodging scooters abandoned on the sidewalk. A voice cut through the city noise. "Hey man, can you spare $1?" It wasn't the first time JD had heard those words. He had spent enough time in places like this to recognize the familiar rhythm of street requests. Usually, it was a quick nod or a polite shake of the head, and then life moved on. But something about this man, maybe the way his voice wavered or how he didn't immediately make eye contact, made JD slow down. The man was thin, but not just in the way hunger wears a person down. It was the kind of thin that hollows out the face, making the eyes seem bigger than they should. His clothes were a mismatched collection of layers, more about survival than style. His beard was patchy, his hands cracked from exposure. He wasn't aggressive, wasn't pushy, just standing there waiting, as if he had asked this 1,000 times before and expected nothing. JD stopped. "What's your name?" The man blinked, caught off guard by the question. That wasn't how this usually went. Most people either dropped a bill in his hand or walked away. He hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Eddie." JD studied him for a moment. Around them, people walked past, barely noticing. To them, this was just another exchange between a man with influence and someone most would ignore. But something about Eddie kept JD rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the way his shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in exhaustion. Maybe it was the quiet dignity with which he asked for help. Not demanding, not performing, just asking. "You live around here?" JD asked. Eddie let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I live wherever I can. You know how it is?" JD nodded but didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he asked, "How long have you been out here?" Eddie shifted, glancing toward the street as if deciding whether to answer or just walk away. "Too long." JD exhaled, his breath visible in the cool air. He could feel eyes on him now. Someone had stopped nearby, maybe eavesdropping, maybe recording. It didn't matter. What he said next would. Eddie stuffed his hands deeper into the pockets of his oversized jacket, gripping at nothing, as if the motion itself provided warmth. JD watched him. Most politicians would have walked away by now, or at best, tossed a few dollars before moving on. But JD didn't. Reach for his wallet. Eddie noticed. His expression flickered, shifting between expectation and disappointment, like he had already rehearsed this outcome in his mind. "I just need $1, he said again, softer this time, as if lowering the request might change the answer. JD glanced down the street. A small group had started watching. A man leaned against a light post, pretending to check his phone. A woman slowed her pace, grocery bag in hand. A teenager hovered nearby, his hands stuffed in the front pocket of his hoodie, eyes flicking between Eddie and JD. The city had a way of turning private moments into public spectacle. JD looked back at Eddie. "What would you do with it?" Eddie huffed out something between a laugh and a scoff. "Ain't that the question?" JD didn't smile. He wasn't joking. Eddie's expression hardened slightly. $1 don't get you much these days. Maybe a coffee. Maybe a piece of bread if you know where to go? He paused then, quieter. Or maybe just a moment where I don't feel like nothing. The weight of those words sat heavy between them. They weren't defensive. They weren't begging. They were just true. JD's jaw tightened. He glanced at Eddie's hands again, still stuffed in his jacket pockets, fingers shifting as if trying to hold on to something invisible. "You used to work?" JD asked. Eddie let out another bitter laugh. "Yeah, before life got in the way." JD nodded slightly. "What was the job?" Eddie hesitated, then shrugged. "Plumber, not the fancy kind. Residential work mostly. Fixed leaky pipes, replaced busted water heaters." He shook his head. "Ain't much demand for a guy who don't got a fixed address, though." JD didn't argue. He had heard stories like this before, people falling through the cracks so fast they barely had time to brace for impact. Eddie rubbed his chin, his fingers brushing over uneven stubble. "So, you gonna give me $1 or what?" JD's response wasn't what anyone expected. "I'll give you something better." Eddie's forehead creased. "Man, I ain't asking for a sermon." "It's not a sermon," JD said. Eddie stared at him, wary. Around them, the street noise seemed to quiet, as if the city itself was waiting to see what would happen next. "When's the last time someone gave you a real shot?" JD asked. Eddie furrowed his brow. "What, like a job?" "Like anything." The question caught Eddie off guard. He blinked, looking past JD as if searching for an answer in the cityscape. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Been a while." JD nodded. "You ever try to get off the streets?" Eddie shot him a look. "Man, what kind of question is that?" JD didn't flinch. Eddie scoffed, rubbing the side of his face. "You think I want to be out here? You think this is some kind of choice?" JD stayed quiet, letting him talk. "I tried shelters," Eddie continued. "Half of them full up before I even get in the door. Tried work. You know what they tell me? Come back when you got a phone. Come back when you got an address." He let out a humorless chuckle. "Like I could pull that out of thin air." JD crossed his arms, listening. Eddie shook his head. "You ever been homeless?" "No." Eddie smirked. "Yeah, didn't think so." JD tilted his head slightly. "But I've been poor." Eddie looked at him differently now, still skeptical, but maybe a little less dismissive. "Yeah," JD nodded. "Grew up in a house where sometimes the heat didn't work, where the fridge was mostly empty. I know what it's like to go to school wearing the same clothes 2-3 days in a row." Eddie sniffed, rubbing his nose with the back of his hand. "Yeah, well, bet you had a way out." JD held his gaze. Took a while. A beat of silence stretched between them. Around them, the small crowd had grown. People lingered, watching. A man in a baseball cap held up his phone, pretending to check messages, but clearly recording. A woman whispered something to her friend, eyes flicking between JD and Eddie. Whatever was about to happen next, people would remember. Eddie let out a sharp breath. "So, what? You're just gonna sit there and tell me to try harder? That if I just work more, everything will be fine?" Vance shook his head. "No." Eddie narrowed his eyes. "Then what?" Vance reached into his jacket pocket and pulled something out. It wasn't money. It was a small, folded piece of paper. He held it out. Eddie looked at it suspiciously. "What's that?" "A name?" A number? He didn't take it. What for? Someone who can help. Eddie gave him a doubtful look. Help? How? They run a program. Housing first. No strings attached. Eddie scoffed. Yeah, right. Like it's that easy. Vance didn't lower his hand. No, it's not. But it's real. Eddie hesitated. He had heard all this before, been given flyers for shelters already full, numbers for programs with wait lists, months long. He wasn't sure if this was any different, but something about Vance's face, the way he wasn't smiling, wasn't trying to sell him anything, made Eddie pause. Why are you doing this? Eddie asked. Vance's answer was simple. Because someone once did it for me. Eddie swallowed, his eyes shifting between Vance and the paper. He wasn't the only one watching. Not everyone in the crowd approved of what was happening. He stared at the folded paper like it was a trick, a test. He had seen handouts before, crumpled pamphlets from churches offering prayers instead of solutions, business cards from social workers who never answered their phones. But this moment felt different. Finally, Eddie reached out and took the paper, though he shot Vance a skeptical glance. He unfolded it with rough fingers, hands shaking from the cold. The name written inside meant nothing to him. Neither did the number. Could be real. Could be another dead end. He exhaled sharply. So that's it? He looked up at Vance. No dollar? Oh, phew. People in the crowd scoffed. Someone muttered under their breath. A man in a baseball cap adjusted his phone, still recording. Vance stayed calm. Would $1 really help? Eddie let out a bitter laugh. Wouldn't hurt. Vance held his gaze. Wouldn't change anything either. Eddie clenched his jaw. Man, I ain't asking you to save me. I just asked for a damn dollar. Another scoff from the crowd. A woman shook her head. Just give him the money. Man. Vance ignored the voices. His focus stayed on Eddie. You said you worked before plumbing, right? Eddie exhaled hard. Yeah. What about it? Vance pulled out his phone. I know a guy who runs a contracting business. He's always looking for workers. He'll take a chance on people who need a second shot. Eddie squinted. You serious? Vance nodded. I make the call. You show up, you work, you get paid. No games. The crowd stirred. A teenager whispered something to his friend. A man near the curb, watching silently, shook his head and muttered, politicians, man. Always a stunt. Eddie let out a dry laugh. So let me get this straight. I ask for $1 and you're offering me a job? Vance's expression didn't change. I'm offering you a way out. Eddie tightened his grip on the paper. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, waiting to see what he'd do. Would he take the offer or tell Vance to go to hell? Someone in the crowd snapped. Is this some kind of joke? The voice came from a man in his 40s, standing near the curb, with a grocery bag slung over his arm. His face was skeptical, his mouth curled in disbelief. He didn't ask for a job interview, the man continued. He asked for a damn dollar. A cup of coffee. You really think a guy living on the streets can just show up to work? A few others murmured in agreement. Vance didn't look away from Eddie. You tell me. Eddie's mouth went dry. His fingers twitched. He had been stuck in this life for so long, he wasn't sure if he even knew how to want something different anymore. The paper felt like it was burning a hole in his hand. And then he did something no one expected. Eddie curled his fingers around the paper, like he was holding onto something fragile. His breath felt heavy in his chest. A job. A real shot. Not a dollar, not pity, something bigger. And yet, the weight of the stairs made his skin crawl. He could feel the judgment from those who weren't homeless, who had warm beds to go back to. You gonna take it, or what? The man with the grocery bag challenged. Or is this just another excuse? Eddie shot him a glare. What's it to you? The man scoffed. I've seen guys like you 100 times. Always a reason why something ain't good. Enough. Eddie's jaw clenched. You don't know a damn thing about me. The man laughed dryly. I know you ain't worked in years. I know you're out here begging instead of trying. And I know you ain't about to take that offer. And if you do, you'll quit the second it gets hard. The words hit harder than Eddie wanted to admit. A part of him did wonder if he still had it in him. If he could wake up at 5 a.m., push through the exhaustion, show up, prove himself. And what if this was just another lie? He turned back to Vance. What happens if this is bullshit? If I show up and they got nothing for me? Vance didn't blink. Then you call me. Eddie narrowed his eyes. Call you? Vance nodded, holding up his phone. I don't give my number lightly. But if they don't give you work, you call me. I'll find you something else. A murmur went through the crowd. The teenager whispered, Yo, is this real? The man with the grocery bag scoffed but said nothing else. Eddie's heart pounded. It was too much. Too real. He had spent so long being ignored, avoided, dismissed. And now, this an actual chance? He swallowed hard. I don't even got a phone. Vance didn't hesitate. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small burner phone. He held it out. Now you do. The crowd went silent. Someone gasped. Eddie stared at the phone like it was a foreign object. No one had ever done something like this for him before. Then, a voice from the crowd cut through the moment. This is all for show. Eddie's grip on the phone tightened. His heart, which had been pounding with something close to hope, clenched. The man who spoke was older, with a salt and pepper beard. This some kind of political stunt? Cameras rolling, people watching, and suddenly you're out here saving a homeless guy? What happens when they stop watching? Vance met the man's stare without flinching. What I did today doesn't change just because people are watching. If you think it does, that says more about the world you've seen than it does about me. The man scoffed and walked away. A woman in the crowd spoke up. So what happens now? Eddie looked at the phone, at the number, at the chance. He licked his lips, then stuffed the phone into his pocket. Guess I make a call. Vance nodded. That's all you gotta do.